To kick off our session, it's my pleasure to welcome Sean Graglia, mixed reality expert and lead marketing consultant at Alencia XR, who will guide us through today's session. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks for kicking us off, Adam. Hi, folks. I'm Sean Graglia. I lead marketing for Alencia XR and HoloAnatomy. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'll start by thanking everyone for spending time with us today and welcoming past friends and new connections through the American Association for Anatomy. In this session, you'll be hearing directly from someone at the forefront of driving better anatomy learning in the allied health education space. She's going to be talking about how they're using collaborative immersive technology to achieve better learning outcomes. Let's go right over the agenda and then we'll dive in. And I'll ask for the slides to be reshared if they can. And I'll go over the agenda while we're doing that. So really, I'll step back and say the goal with the session today is to actually shed light on what emerging technology is achieving to get a better learning outcomes. And we hope that you leave wondering, is there a better approach to anatomy learning than maybe your institution or organization is actually doing today? And what steps can you take to actually get to that outcome? So today's session will be broken into three parts. First, our guest, I'll introduce in a few minutes, will share with us her personal experience in driving better understanding of the spatial anatomy when it comes to allied health education. Next, we'll have a Q&A session where you'll have a chance to, after the formal presentation, ask any questions you want to hear about the story that we talked about or about HoloAnatomy. And finally, we'll leave you with a few steps on how to get started on your own journey for anatomy learning transformation. So let me introduce today's guest who will be sharing her journey with immersive anatomy learning. And I have to say, I am so fortunate in my role at Alencia XR to be working with leaders that are inspiring the sort of change that we're going to be talking about today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joanne Hodder, professor of applied health with over 20 years experience in biomechanics and kinesiology education. Joanne actually, Dr. Hodder actually holds a PhD in biomechanics from my alma mater, McMaster University. Dr. Hodder, I'll let you take over the presentation from here.
Thank you so much, Sean. It's my pleasure to be here today and speak with all of you about my personal journey when it came to adapting HoloAnatomy into a number of our programs that we have at Sheridan. So my primary or home program is the Kinesiology and Health Promotion Program. However, I also teach anatomy to our osteopathic manual practitioners, and I support the HoloAnatomy piece for our athletic therapy folks, as well as some of our nursing colleagues. So I have like a second agenda or overview of what my talk is going to be today. And the first thing I wanted to start with was really what the terms VR, MR, AR, XR all meant, because when we were first introduced as an institution to HoloAnatomy, I was very novice in what any of this really was. And that journey for us started a number of years ago. So I thought I would just start with kind of reviewing those terms and then going through a little bit of what HoloAnatomy is, what my initial personal response to it was, and then some key moments that I had while we started to adopt this into our curriculum. And then I'll summate with some of the benefits that I've seen within our teaching spaces with using these holograms to enhance our anatomy learning. So just to review those terms, virtual reality, this is a situation where the user is not able to see their surroundings. It's fully immersive. It's intended to simulate a real world experience. However, you kind of get lost into that space. When it comes to augmented reality or AR, this is technology that will superimpose a computer-generated image. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner an example that I've given here where perhaps you have an image of an empty room and you can superimpose things like interior design into that space. And so this is considered a partially immersive experience. Mixed reality uses a combination of that virtual and real world environment. So it allows digital objects to coexist and be interacted with within that space. And so you can see where you are, which has a lot of benefits that I'll talk about a little bit later when it comes to our students. But it also permits you to be interactive with these models, which you won't necessarily see in augmented reality. In extended reality, this is really an umbrella term. It kind of encompasses all of these technologies that blend that virtual and physical environments together. So when it comes to HoloAnatomy, we're talking about a mixed reality technology here, where we have a partially immersive experience, the ability to interact with objects that appear within our space, though we're still able to see our physical space around us. That allows for actually some really neat collaboration that can happen between students in the classroom. So for those of you that are maybe not familiar with HoloAnatomy itself, this has a number of kind of key components to it. The first component is the hub, and this is where we get to design and create as instructors. And so this is our space to allow us to create what holograms we want to see within our anatomy labs. It allows us to create that environment for our students to be taken on a journey in the lab to explore the anatomy we need them to see. It also has a dashboard that allows us to do things like examinations, especially bell ringer style examinations, really well. The other component is the viewer itself. And so this is where we get to actually collaborate, see what you've created as an instructor in lab, and interact with our students and create that learning experience. So you have two libraries really to pull on when it comes to HoloAnatomy. At Sheridan, we take advantage of both. So there's the HoloAnatomy itself, which gives you access, I think, and you can correct me later, Sean, if this is inaccurate, to over 9,000 anatomical assets. They're visually very stunning, and I'll talk a little bit more later about how impactful that has been for our students. But there's also a neuroanatomy component or library that focuses very narrowly down onto the brain stem, spinal cord, meninges, emerging nervous system. So initial responses to HoloAnatomy, and I'm going to take you kind of on my personal journey for this. So my first interaction with HoloAnatomy was way back in COVID days, and we were having a virtual meeting with Case Western as we were considering purchasing HoloAnatomy. And so I was invited in the meeting by my senior management and to get my initial impressions of what I thought this technology could do. And I will admit, trying to really understand 3D immersive technology on a 2D screen can be very underwhelming. So I was in that position where I was, to be honest, on the fence. I was like, I don't know how beneficial this is going to be for our students and their learning. Thankfully, our senior management kind of saw more potential in it than I initially did. And they jumped in full head force and decided to purchase HoloAnatomy and all the headsets that we required in order to adapt it within our labs. Once I had the opportunity during our training to view the holograms for the first time, I was completely sold. It was transformational for me. The ability to be able to literally put your head through the anatomical assets, see spatial relationships between each of those anatomical structures, be able to interact and see points of view that you could never really get access to when it comes to either a cadaver or a plastic model was unparalleled in my experience. And there's also a lot of research out there to support the use of this technology or holographic displays in enhancing our learners' retention in particular. And so there's a number of studies out there that you can see that has seen an increase in retention to up to 40%, especially when you make an interactive learning session with the actual virtual reality or in this case, mixed reality software. So I have a number of key moments when we jumped in, had our hands on this technology, and then needed to adapt it into our curriculum. And the first key moment was really just getting over the logistics of it all. Thankfully, at Sheridan, we did have a technologist who manages all of our VR technology. And so they were able to help us actually just get through the logistics of how do we create our lab spaces in a way that can facilitate students looking around these holograms that we're going to bring into our lab spaces. The other part was really on me as a curriculum developer and instructor to create or reimagine the current content that we had. And part of that was really predicting how students will want to view and interact with the holograms. And at this time, we didn't have access to these awesome webinars that we've seen. And I hadn't had the ability to listen to some other colleagues who've gone through this process and learned from them on how they adapted it within their curriculum. And so one of the key things that was tricky for us was that it can be time consuming on the front end. The wonderful part about HoloAnatomy is that you have the ability to create what you want, what you need for your learners. However, that does mean there's an investment of time up in the kind of front end for you to be able to design that initial learning outcome. Thankfully, I took a relatively stable approach. So I only designed or overhauled 3 of our labs initially when I started to look at our curriculum and to bring in the HoloAnatomy piece. And so where I started is all the way over here on the left that you'll see with the yellow outline, and that was with label diagrams. So it was essentially a really expanded, cool way to look at what we see in our textbooks. And so the benefits of it is that it's very clear, it's concise, it to some degree requires less memorization from your instructor because everything is labeled for students to be able to see it. And students' reactions the first time that they put the HoloLens on, and again, Sean, you can maybe speak to this a little bit later in our Q&A since you got to witness this in my lab at one time, is usually awe. I guess that's the best way I can put it. It's just awe. They're very awestruck by it. They have this kind of wow moment. It's incredible to experience for the first time. I feel like I get to relive that experience every time I have a new cohort of students that use the technology. However, these students are also very used to a ton of stimulation. And by lab 2, because the engagement was fairly passive in terms of just looking at labeled diagrams, essentially, it's kind of acted like a flash in the pan. And so I had to redesign how I was going to increase and enhance that engagement piece that I talked about earlier. And so what I ended up doing is flipping it. I basically had all of the structures that the students needed to identify listed in their lab. And on each slide or each scene, I had all of the structures that I wanted them to look at colorized, but not labeled. So this led to a lot more student engagement, a lot more collaboration between students who are looking at each hologram. And it allowed me also to be able to just simulate a little bit more of that learning in situ. The little bit of a drawback of this is that in order to prep that out, it's more than just, okay, here's the anatomy I want to look at. You have to go in and individually colorize each of those specific structures that you want to highlight. We've since then kind of progressed and are moving towards now allowing this to exist in a more independent learning space. And so if you've looked at some of the previous webinars that HoloAnatomy and LensiXR have hosted, you'll see some, for example, from AT Still, that's how they ideated this curriculum to begin with, was to allow students to engage with the models independently. And so we're going to enhance that part of our curriculum in this upcoming year and allow basically the students to have access to this technology in an open lab space. And so we don't need to spend necessarily as much time within our labs to have students get as much out of the HoloAnatomy piece as they would like. We can give them additional time to look at it again or to prepare for examinations within open lab space. Again, it takes a little bit of time in terms of creating engaging open lab space, not just put the lenses on and look at things, but how do you create those learning sessions so that the students themselves have something to do when they're looking at the holograms, not just to passively look at it. The third moment that I had was really when I was trying to engage other faculty to use this technology. And so obviously we have adapted it within our anatomical courses. However, we've also, for me, I've used it in a number of other courses that I teach, sometimes just as one-offs. So for example, I teach motor control and learning as well. So as we have the neuro toolkit, I'm allowed to just pull in that brainstem, the whole nervous system, and be able to show students that level of complexity from top down in a really cool way that engages them and excites them. However, not everybody in my faculty, I will have full disclosure, was as enthused about this as I was. I've usually a pretty techie person. I like using technology to enhance engagement in my classroom, but not everybody in my faculty felt the same way. However, I was tasked with being the faculty lead for this technology within our applied health disciplines. And so really had to come up with ways in order for us to engage those individuals who perhaps were a little bit more resistant to it. And there was two really big reasons that they cited. Part of it was time. And so having someone who can maybe be that faculty lead or go-to that is very enthusiastic, that has perhaps put that time in and created a number of slide decks like I have that other faculty can borrow from or have as a kind of launching pad has been really helpful. So that collaboration piece between our faculty members and departments to share resources has been really, really helpful. And again, it's also encouraging them that this doesn't have to replace or take over necessarily what they're currently doing. I think that a lot of people were afraid that we had to replace or were thinking that we had to replace a large part of our 2-hour lab time with the holo piece. However, what I found is that it works very well in a more complementary manner to some of the other ways that we typically would teach anatomy within our labs. So just to give you a little bit of background about the kinesiology students and the osteopathy students that I teach, truthfully, they're pretty distinct in terms of their personalities. And I am not sure if any of you out in that are viewing this today have experience teaching in a kinesiology department. However, our students are very hands-on learners typically. Within the college system where I was teaching at Sheridan, these students tend to not necessarily be top of the class, cream of the crop. Those students usually will end up going to institutions like Master or U of T, etc. Most students that we have coming to the college are there either because they have a lifestyle that requires them to work and have a little bit more of a community, closer college experience. Some of them actually didn't like being in a big classroom, having 300 other students around them and being known as a number, not as a person, which is what Sheridan affords us. Is we have very more boutique style classroom sizes. We have usually a max class of 55, for example, is the largest first year class that I've taught in the kinesiology program. So we have the ability to really get to know our students well, to have smaller group learning and engagement with our students on the regular. However, they're not necessarily always super highly motivated, especially when it comes to memorization. And so you'll see that I'm jumping ahead a little bit as the last piece here, but it's to understand that everyone may have to adapt or create and ideate how this curriculum will work for their students, depending on what their students are like specifically. The other piece I would say that's really beneficial when it comes to teaching with HoloAnatomy and holograms in general is the sustainability of it. Obviously, if you have a full cadaver lab and have replacement costs for those cadavers, it can be incredibly costly. We have a synthetic cadaver within our lab spaces, which has been found to actually still be pretty costly. We do some dissection of that synthetic cadaver throughout the year, but then we have to ship her back and get her re-sewn back together every year. And that has to go from Ontario to Florida in each spring semester. The other piece too is that if you have, whether synthetic or a real cadaver, a situation where you do accidentally cut a tissue that you weren't intending, then you lose some of that anatomical fidelity. So where was that tissue initially going to be sitting? You no longer can see now, for example, for me, most important in biomechanics, where that muscle fiber direction is. The other piece that I found to be perhaps the most beneficial was the spatial awareness. Our students need to understand function more than just memorize body parts. And so for them to be able to understand spatial awareness, to be able to look at perspectives that are not permitted by a cadaver or a plastic model. And an example I give all the time when I talk about this is if, for example, you had the shoulder up, just the shoulder girdle. I often will do this with only rotator cuff muscles, the scapula, humerus, and clavicle there, and then have the subacromial bursa and nerves and blood vessels in place. I ask the students to approach kind of in that frontal plane and move themselves through the shoulder. And you can see how narrow that subacromial space becomes as you move through. So I always give the example of, imagine now we have a tendon that's inflamed, how much more narrow this space gets. This is how we lead to something like impingement syndrome, for example, for our shoulders. And so in a classroom full of kinesiology students, who half of whom are athletes, generally speaking, and majority of those athletes have experienced a shoulder injury, this is where their appetite really gets satiated and they get to be able to fully understand the function of the anatomy that they're learning. As I mentioned, I find it a very complementary technology, and so it pairs very well with other didactic methods. I have the example of palpation here. This is something that we still do quite a lot of within our programs, as it's very much required in a lot of, especially our osteopathy and athletic therapy programming, in order for them to do assessment. We still palpate those bony landmarks to enhance learning and understanding with our kinesiology students, though it's not necessarily part of our practice specifically for bony landmarks, though we do need to do it in order to do things like skin fold measurements, etc. I recently, though, had a conversation with a colleague who teaches in a medical school, and they have no longer permitted them to use palpation within their anatomy labs. I think there's a number of issues here, potentially for enhanced cultural sensitivity, potentially for that consent piece, depending on where it sits within your curriculum, that anatomy course. However, they're no longer allowed to do that hands-on palpation piece, which is, I think, a core for at least our learners to still retain. And so if that piece is missing, I feel like having another tool in your toolkit where you can have students really start to understand function and that spatial awareness without having to get their hands on it can be really helpful. It permits independent learning, the possibility of independent study in a way that is more engaging than just looking at a screen that maybe has 3D holograms on it or 3D anatomical specimens on it that they can click through and rotate. I've looked at a number of the different ones and had students bring me a number of different resources that they use to study, but translating 3D structure onto a 2D screen or a 2D page, there's always going to be limitations to it. And so they benefit greatly from being able to see things in 3D and allow them to really fully understand function relationships of anatomical structures in a way that just aren't permitted when you look at it in 2D. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very motivating for students. I've literally had students come and approach me and ask if they bought their own headset, could they have access to the subscription so that they could use it on their own time. That's how enthusiastic they were about it and how much they were willing to spend thousands of dollars on a headset just to be able to learn better. So I think students' appetite and motivation is something that at least our students benefit from a ton, being able to get over that big, scary hurdle of what looks like a mountain of memorization by being able to break it down into accessible and enjoyable learning engagements makes it something that allows them to get to the goal of what we want from them, which is to understand where everything is, how they relate to each other, and how we can actually apply that then into settings where we want to have peak performance or perhaps minimize forces on the body so that they don't have injuries occur.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hodder. And just thinking about our conversation and what you ended off with on motivation, that's the key moment as instructors. And in a very distant past, I have done some instruction at Sheridan College. And that moment that they click in and they understand, oh, that's how it works. And I saw that at the session that I attended with you, where the kinesiology students are able to just peer right in and understand, oh, that's how the connections make. That's where the meaning comes through in that experience. So it really relates to the benefit you were talking about actually being able to immerse themselves and really understand that spatial understanding. So that was very striking. The other thing that struck me in what you shared is how key it was to have the leads to drive adoption. You mentioned a faculty lead, which yourself did a great job leading Sheridan through the adoption process, but also a technology person. These are things that we're hearing as a theme for successful institutions that are adopting HoloAnatomy, to be able to ease any pain that often comes with a change, and actually see towards the other end, where what we're aiming for is actually the student impact. So very good. A lot of the benefits you mentioned, we're hearing common out of the conversations we're having with the other folks. So very, very good presentation, and thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure we could go on, but I suspect there are other questions that we have from folks in the audience. Adam, would you like to share any questions that have come through?
Yeah, there's some great presentation, Dr. Hodder. It's always a pleasure to listen to you speak. And yeah, there's some questions here. And the first one I'd like to ask is, have you noticed improvements in student learning as a result of using HoloAnatomy?
Yes, so I will say that when it comes to the immediate engagement, we didn't necessarily see that there was an increase in our overall course outcomes that first year. The second year, when we kind of got our mojo, I would say, as an institution, that's when we started to see the increase. And where we're really seeing it play out truthfully is in our upper year courses. So the retention piece for us at Sheridan, our anatomy sits within the fall of our second year. And then those students go off and they do a bunch of other courses that kind of use a little bit of anatomy, but not a whole ton. But then they really start to require it again in fall of third year, and then again in fall of fourth year. And that's where we're really seeing the payoff, is that we just have that first kind of cohort of students that came through heading into our fourth year now, but went through third year this past fall, that have a much greater understanding. So when they're in their sports injuries course, for example, that understanding of spatial awareness, function, they're far better able to transfer that knowledge over into the courses that they need it as they move forward. So that's where we're seeing the biggest payoffs, I think, right now, is the fact that they've retained that knowledge better than we've had in previous years. So when they're doing something like advanced strength and conditioning, we ask them, okay, what are your knee extensors? What's on the front side of your thigh? They actually remember what those muscles are now, as opposed to just sitting there scratching their head being like, that was 2 years ago, I have no clue. Right? So that's the big payoff that we're seeing.
Cementing the learning and reinforcing so they remember. I'll drop a link in the chat for everyone in case you want to take a look at some of the research that has been done. You might have heard us talk about it the last session, where there's hints of retaining longer, up to 40% more, reducing study time and things like that. And what struck me about going through the story, the origin story, was that research was done before it was rolled out. So it was a well-vetted solution by the time it came to Sheridan College. So great story. Adam, is there another question that we have from the folks online?
Yes, we do. How do you see the use of HoloAnatomy evolving at Sheridan? Are there any plans to integrate it further into residency programs or continuing medical education?
Yes, so we actually are just in the process of designing a new program or set of programs within diagnostic imaging. So I had the privilege of being able to demonstrate the HoloAnatomy piece for the Professional Advisory Council that sat on that development. And because of how all of the anatomical assets were created using those 3D images, it matches and pairs so naturally for diagnostic imaging, because They were basically developed, from my understanding, from MRI images and from those 3D spatial files. So that's something that they're very excited to have launch, hopefully within the next year. I think they were hoping for January, but it may end up being next fall. But that's going to be one place where we see it moving. Our osteopathic manual practitioner program is also fairly new. So that one only is now in its first cohorts going into their third year this fall. So they have a number of further anatomy courses as well as neurology courses that will be continuing to take advantage of both libraries, the HoloAnatomy and the HoloAnatomy Neuro Library. But I'm also encouraging our colleagues to think of occasions where they can use it in kind of a one-off scenario. And so, as I gave the example during the talk, I just bring I don't have a lab with my motor control course at the moment, but I still take that time out of my class to bring them into our lab space and have that experience for them. Or if I have to, I'll arrange it outside of our lecture time in order for our students to solidify some of that learning that they're doing in lecture and have a bit more of that interactive, engaged space, and take advantage, like I said, of the ability for us to really do some small group learning where we have smaller class sizes available. And so, especially with the next, where we have a lot of animations, especially in that cardiac section, I feel like that's going to be such a natural fit for some of our physiology courses that we have moving forward, especially our pathophysiology course, where we can put in some ECG strips in there that are not typical and compared to typical. I think that's going to be very powerful for our students coming forward.
I recall other conversations I've had in the past with some of your colleagues about how you've been able to showcase leadership in this space by having other schools come by, dignitaries come by. It's a great way to show your innovation, which Sheridan, frankly, is known for. Great insights. Adam, any other questions?
Yes, of course. We got a couple more. What other curriculum changes have you done since adopting HoloAnatomy? How has it impacted your lectures?
Yes, yeah. So we initially, that first kind of year that we adopted it, it was pretty much exclusively for our lab time, essentially. And just to maybe give an overview of how our labs will typically run, usually we'll start with the HoloAnatomy piece. That will generally be about 20 minutes of a 2-hour lab. Sometimes we'll circle back to that depending on the lab for the day and what we're covering. But that's usually where it sits. We take a little break from that. We'll move on to palpation and then any functional testing that we might need to know for that day. So if we're looking at muscles, for example, we'll look at some functional strength testing or evaluation. If we're looking at joints or ligaments or bony architecture, then we'll look at something like range of motion testing, both active and passive. And then, like I said, if we're moving on to different structures, we'll then come back to the HoloAnatomy at the end. Generally speaking, though, a lot of our students had indicated that they wanted to see it more and they wanted to see it again, which is why we're moving towards this open lab model, which will allow them to have more time to look at the anatomy within the lens and be able to spend a little bit slower learning. I just went to a teaching and learning conference and learned about slow teaching and slow learning and the benefit of that. And so it allows them to slow down that pace a little bit and explore it. And now that the new version has a lot more interactivity built into it, I think it allowed the students to actually take control. Again, I don't know if there's anybody here that currently is a user of HoloAnatomy, but the take control, just to describe it to those who don't, is an option that you have when you are in the space with the headset on, where students actually can take control and allow them to, for example, we have a magnifying bubble that we can put anywhere on the anatomical asset that's in front of them. And they can grab that bubble and put it wherever they want and say, this is what I want to know about, or what about this? We can take that bubble and rotate it and look at the anatomy in any kind of point of view or perspective that we wish to as well with that bubble. I will be honest, when I've got 20 plus students in a lab, I don't let them take control often because it becomes the Wild West, right? So everyone's just trying to do it. So one person kind of has it and then someone else takes it. And now all of a sudden our magnifying bubbles flying halfway across the room, or we've got a heart that's, as big as the room is. So I often will limit the ability or ask them not to use that function until we're in a little bit more of a smaller group learning type of session. However, in open labs, I can see that working very, very well because we can book it out into smaller groups and let them have control a little bit more of that hologram in their learning.
That's great. I have one more question from the audience here. What advice would you have for institutions that are considering the technology?
Do it. To be honest, I think this is going to be the future of anatomy education, to be truthful. And I talked about the sustainability piece from a cost perspective. I don't know, I can't speak to our neighbors to the south. However, trying to get anatomical specimens here can be very tricky. I know a lot of institutions have kind of gone fully to a pro-section type of model, where they have prepared anatomical specimens that are, plastinated or preserved in other ways that they can use and reuse a number of times, but you don't get to necessarily interact with it in the same way that you would if you were to do dissection on a cadaver. And so I think that for me, this is the way of the future. I think that our students are expecting a level of technology adoption within our spaces that we need to, as institutions, keep up with. And they're very used to lots of flashy stimulation. And when we just give them a textbook with a picture on it and lines that point to an anatomical structure, it doesn't land. At least it didn't with my students. It doesn't land with them in the same way as when they can see it and interact with it. And as we know, there's going to be more interaction available soon. And just to loop back, Adam, to your last question, I forgot to mention this. When I overhauled the labs, that was the first year. The second year, the visuals were so compelling when it comes to, and the clarity of them, when it comes to the designer, the hub, which is what they're called now, the designer tool. I ended up doing screen grabs and replacing, I would say, probably about 70% of the images in my lectures with the imagery from HoloAnatomy, because it was so easy for me to color code it. They could clearly see what I was talking about, as opposed to relying on a tiny little line that was pointing to some structure that looked very similar to the structure next to it. So that's something that I found to be tremendously helpful. And I often find myself now using that designer tool even interactively in lecture. So I would pull the dashboard up, or the designer tool up. And then, for example, if they had a hard time locating a structure on that 2D slide, I could put it into X-ray mode. So I was like, okay, here's our anatomy. This is the actual structure I'm looking for or talking about. So it allows students to really engage with it in different ways, rather than just exclusively within the lab itself.
That's excellent. That's all the questions I have from here, Sean.
Awesome. And I can see by the clock we're coming closer to time. I wanted to pick up one of the points you talked about throughout the presentation too, was the level of engagement and driving the understanding. And then you also just mentioned about how the technology expectation. We keep reading reports of how students are distracted by their phones, but they're also have an expectation of modern technology, and they're the most exposed to XR technology, yet it's the least adapted in schools. So it's amazing that you've been able to use this as a powerful tool to re-engage the students and drive that learning home. So fantastic job, and just want to thank you for sharing your journey today. And your change that you have driven is really inspiring. Thank you very much, Dr. Hodder. So
welcome.
I'll leave you with just a few final thoughts, and we'll just move on to the close slide and cover a few of those with you. Webinars are actually a great way to gain these kind of insights from institutions like the one we just talked about. And I encourage you to take a look at the past webinars that we have featuring TCU, AT Still University, Kansas Com, Finger Lakes College. You'll also, even as you learn more on the site, you'll actually find other different stories about anywhere from a high school all the way up to a medical institution. So it really can adapt to whatever the use case is and however learning needs to take place on anatomy. So, and then the final thing is, when you look at the challenge, and we talked about the technology changing, the challenge that educators face trying to learn, well, how do I adopt that as a best practice? And you heard some of the best practices here today. Rely on Alencia XR. Let us be your guide and your partner in how this technology can be used to drive better outcomes and really raise the pedagogy of our execution. And so when you want to get deeper, by all means, reach back out to us. We'd be happy to connect with you, share a little bit more about the insights we talked about, and really explore together and really run you through even a demonstration. So with that, concludes the formal presentation today. I will close with a final thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hodder. Thank you, everyone who took the time to join us today. We'd love to hear your feedback. And so when, as a follow-up to the webinar, you're going to receive a survey when the webinar ends. Really appreciate you take the time to give us the feedback and recommendations of what you'd like to see and what you liked. You'll also be receiving follow-up emails in the next couple of days with the links to material and a recording that we provided. And so I just want to close by saying thank you for your time today again, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.